So, Sandy, are you ready for me to share my screen, or you want
Yeah,
me to
go
do that
ahead
now?
and
Okay.
share your screen, and I want to take this opportunity to introduce to you Dr. Keith Harmoney, who's a rangeland scientist at the Agriculture Research Center in Hayes. He's been there well over 20 years. And the great thing about some of Keith's work, not only has um, he has current research looking at rangeland, but he has also uh, used the historic records and the older uh, data that was collected at Hayes to look at some of the other historic droughts of the 30s and the 50s that I think really helps make him well suited to help address this question that we're facing this year about how we should approach pasture management and turnout time this year. So Heath, it looks like there's a few fortunates that have some moisture underneath, but a lot of dry conditions. So with that, I think we'll turn it over to you, and we'll get going.
All right. Well, thanks for everyone joining us today. We have several folks on here. I wasn't sure how many to expect, but it looks like we have a pretty good crowd on here with us today. And basically, this webinar topic came about because myself and other folks within the K-State system have had many people asking about grass turnout this year and whether our pastures are ready or how we should approach our grass turnout this season. And so that's kind of where this webinar came from the several questions that we've had from several folks throughout the state. And so in preparing for this, and looking at turning out this year, one thing that we have to do is we have to look at how our conditions ended last season. Last year we had quite a range of pasture conditions throughout the state, from very dry throughout most all the season in the southwest and in the west, and dry late season in the southeast. But then in the northeast part of the state, they had closer to a typical year. So we had kind of a wide range in moisture conditions and the amount of plant growth that took place over last year. So then looking at that, what do we expect to happen for this year? Well, in looking at last year's conditions, we need to assess what our pasture condition was to end the season, whether or not we had more animal removal of dry matter than what we had planned, if our forage demand to forage available balance was not what we expected it to be for the stocking rate that we started last season. The scenario that you see on the screen right now is a scenario that could happen from having a higher stocking rate than what the forage was able to produce last growing season, or it could be from a drought scenario. In either case, one either had more leaf removed during the season than what the plants had available. So then in the end, our plants are starved for leaf material to photosynthesize, to produce carbohydrates and energy for producing buds, for producing root growth, for storing energy for the next season. Or our plants could have been stressed at the end of the year from drought. If they had gone dormant early, they wouldn't be photosynthesizing. And so again, those plants could be starved for carbohydrate for doing all those same things. Less root growth, less leaf there for photosynthesizing and storing energy. And so when we have situations like that, basically we're starting off the next season at a disadvantage. Our plants to start the next year are not going to have that energy to take off and grow right away. They were under stress the prior season, and so we can expect them to have a little bit less potential the next year. And we can especially see that when we look at some of our native hay meadows when we have those hay meadows that are harvested late in the season, those hay meadows, they don't have the leaf material accumulated late in the season to photosynthesize and to store carbohydrates for the next year. And so oftentimes our hay yield the next season is lower. And so this is kind of an equivalent situation. So anyway, when we start off or end a year at a stress level where we have less leaf material there than what we had forage demand from our animals, the next season we start off with I guess somewhat lower expectations. And this is seen from a study that was done several years ago. It's actually a pretty intensive and in-depth study about plant growth, both above ground and below ground. But when we're looking at a balance between forage demand and forage available, this study really looked closely at that. And it showed that when we leave 50% of the forage growth standing, or we only remove 50% of the growth, that there's enough leaf material there for it to photosynthesize and produce carbohydrates that we don't get any root growth stopping. Those plants are able to grow both new leaf material. They have enough there to photosynthesize to produce new leaf material, but also they have enough carbohydrate to keep their roots growing. And that's important because it's those roots that are going to search out the soil depths for more moisture and for nutrients to stay strong and vigorous. But when they got to a point where they removed 70% of the top growth, half the roots stopped growing for 17 days. And so when we're removing more of that upper leaf material, above ground leaf material, than what the plant needs to keep photosynthesizing and producing carbohydrate, something in the plant has to give way. And oftentimes it's the roots. And so 50% of the root mass stop growing for 17 days when they remove 70% of the top growth. When they remove 90% of the top growth, all the roots stop growing for 17 days. And this is really important, especially when we're under drought conditions, under stress, and we're removing more leaf material. We're not only removing leaf, but we're also hindering our root growth and the ability of those roots to take up moisture. And so in a way, we're putting our plants at a disadvantage for being able to go out and explore those soil depths and to uptake more moisture. So it's really important to keep that 50% forage demand and forage available balance. It's also important when we look at trying to capture moisture. In a 20-year stocking rate study that was done out here at Hayes under 3 different stocking rates, they were called a light, moderate, and heavy stocking rate. As we kept more forage residual on the surface, we were able to get more water infiltration into the soil. So under a heavy stocking with less forage residual present, we also had less water infiltration taking place. So as far as inches per hour under the heavy stocking, they only had 0.7 inches of water infiltrating into the soil in 1 hour's time. Whereas under light stocking, they had almost 1.6 inches infiltrating in an hour. So if we got 1.5 inches rainfall under these 3 scenarios, about half of it would be running off under the heavy stocking situation. While under the moderate stocking, we'd still be retaining about 80% of it, and we'd be capturing it all under the light stocking rate scenario. So that's another reason why trying to keep that forage residual there is important. Capturing that water is especially important in the springtime. And looking back at 44 years of data where we have pasture growth data along with our weather data here at our research center, basically I've found that when we have less than our average precipitation in April, May, and June months combined, we have a very direct relationship of precipitation with end of year forage growth. So when we have April plus May plus June precipitation combined at average levels or less, it's a very direct relationship of how much forage we're going to have at the end of the year. When we get more than average precipitation, such as the right side of that screen, right of the blue line, the relationship pretty much disappears. And I think a lot of that is because when we get higher than average precipitation, a lot of times those may be under cases where we're getting higher rainfall events at one time. And so we may be losing some of that moisture from runoff, where we're just not able to capture it all because we're getting more precipitation in a short amount of time that we're not able to capture it all and get it in the soil and directly then grow forage from that. But the April, May, and June time period, when we have less than our average precipitation, is a very good predictor for what we're going to have for forage at the end of the year. So those 3 months are critical for us for growth for our grass out here in western Kansas. And this is important because it's going to play into some of what we see for our stocking decisions that we start the year with, but also when it comes to doing some sort of adjustment or modifying that stocking rate early in the season. This is going to be a key player in that. And one of the things that I want you to notice is that I have sort of a yellow coloration towards the bottom half of that graph. And that is the line, leading up to that, the top part of that yellow portion is the average forage production for the experiment pastures where all this data was collected. And so if we look at acquiring 75% of our average precipitation in this April, May, and June time period, which you might be able to hopefully see my pointer on the screen here. But when we achieve about 75% of our precipitation for those 3 months combined, then close to 90% of our years where we achieve this amount of precipitation, we get 90% or 90% or greater of our average production. So it's basically these few years down here that we didn't achieve our or get close to our average production when we had 75% or greater of our April, May, and June precipitation combined for the year. Now, conversely, if we don't achieve 75% of our average precipitation in those 3 months, we have close to a 90% chance that we're going to be below 90% average production for the year. So it's these scenarios here that it's really critical for us to think about doing some adjustments early in the season based on this April, May, and June time period. And we're going to get into that here in just a little bit and in a little bit more detail. But those are just some numbers that I wanted to point out for folks to keep in mind of where some of the suggestions for stocking are going to come from here a little bit later. So in trying to answer some of the questions that were brought about this winter and folks thinking about turning out to grass and stocking this summer, based on stress and the conditions of their pastures last year, there were several different scenarios that could play out. And I thought one of the best ways to go through that would be to have a flow chart for folks to look at. And this flow chart, along with that precipitation data that I just showed, as well as looking at some historical rainfall data for the area where you're located, are going to be key pieces in trying to factor out and trying to follow this flow chart as to what your potential grass turnout time and stocking rate might be to start the year. And so all those things come together to make this flow chart. Now, as it turns out, we start up there, basically an on-site pasture assessment is the main thing that the main way that we want to start this, because each pasture is going to have its unique set of characteristics based on past management and current rainfall, and basically what's happened for that particular operation. So doing an on-site assessment of your pastures is going to be a key component to this, to assess whether or not they were stressed in the prior year or whether they were unstressed and you had adequate leaf material remaining at the end of the season. So doing some sort of on-site assessment is a good way to start this process and to consider whether or not it was stressed in the prior year or unstressed. Now, I would say that in the majority of our years, probably 65 to 75% of our years, we should be spending on the left side of this flow chart, where if our forage demand is matched with our forage available, and we have a good established moderate stocking rate that's appropriate for the pastures that we're considering, in many years, those pastures should be unstressed at the end of the season if we have a balanced demand with a balance of what's available. So anyway, a large portion of our time period should be spent, or could be, on the left side of this flow chart. And I'll go to the next screen and talk about this a little bit more and blown up so you can see it a little better. But when we talk about pastures that are unstressed the year before, we don't have much reason to do any change to the stocking rate the next season. The main reason why we might do any stocking rate adjustment would be whether or not our current soil conditions are dry, or whether our current soil conditions are moist. I can say that in looking at our winter precipitation data here at the research center, and then looking at forage growth for the year, we're not able to predict very well what our final forage production will be based on winter precipitation. But it does show that when we do have soil moisture to start the year, where we did get winter moisture accumulation, that we do have a higher average yield, or higher average yield produced at the end of the season versus when we start the year off with dry soil conditions. And so that's why, going through this flow chart, why I have in here, if you have some current dry soil conditions, you may consider doing some reduction in stocking rate or some delayed turnout. But the biggest portion, or the biggest factor in what's going to take place for growth during the year, is going to be what happens with April, May, and June precipitation. So probably spending a little bit less time on this side of the chart versus the right side of the chart, which is more in line with what our current conditions are. And that is, a lot of our pastures in Kansas ended up last year with having some sort of stress. Either they were stressed at the end of the season from going dormant during the year due to drought, or if those pastures possibly didn't go dormant, they may have been in a situation where we happened to remove more leaf material and had more forage demand from animals than what we were able to produce with the amount of forage that we produced last year because of the lack of rainfall. So anyway, looking at this, for those areas that have pasture that were drought stressed at the end of the last season, you know, they're going to be at a disadvantage to start this growing season. We expect less production out of those. But if we have current moisture in that soil profile in those pastures, you know, they may lack some vigor and some residue from the prior year, but we do have spring moisture in those pastures and they should be able to start growing. But we may delay turnout on those because of the lack of vigor from the prior year. We might delay turnout or reduce stocking rate by up to 10 to 15% on those pastures. Now, if we have current dry soil conditions, you know, they were stressed last year, those pastures, plus we don't have soil moisture in that pasture soil profile currently. So under both situations, we expect to have less dry matter produced in those pastures. And when you put those together, you know, it can compound it even more. So we could expect to delay turnout by up to 2 to 4 weeks and or reduce stocking rate by 15 to 25% in those pastures, because we do know that they're going to be at a disadvantage from the prior year, plus be at a disadvantage because of the lack of soil moisture to start the growing season. Now, doing any further modifications is important based on what we received for that April, May, and June time period for precip. Now, according to that earlier graph I showed, where we're looking at getting 75% of average precip or less, and having less production in those pastures, that May and June time period is very critical for us to do a further assessment of what our early stocking rates are to start the year. So if we have May and June time period where we have less than 75% of average precipitation, we probably could reduce stocking by another 15 to 20%, especially if we had a prior year where that grass was stressed, and we're going to have another season where that grass is stressed. We're pretty sure that we're going to have less than average forage production there. And the accumulation of 2 years together being drought stressed is pretty much a sure chance that, or a sure thing, that we're going to have less than average forage production there. And we're going to really need to do something to adjust that stocking to make sure that we're not trying to remove more leaf material than what those plants are going to have available during that season. If we have more than 75% of average precipitation in that May and June time period, then we may not have to reduce stocking any further, because well, according to the data that we have here at our research center, 90% of the years we've had almost 90% or greater of our average production for that year when we have more than 75% of our average precip. Now, if we have dry conditions to start, and we don't get that May and June precipitation, we could be looking at even a larger reduction. And our information here at the research center shows that when we have a year where we start out with dry soil conditions, and then we also have 75% of our average precip or less, the amount of reduction in precipitation is pretty much the amount of reduction in forage production that we would expect for the year. So if we only achieve 50% of our May and June precipitation, we're only going to achieve about 50% of our forage production for the year. That's what our data shows here at our research center. So we can make adjustments based on that early growing season and do some things to reduce that stocking rate to try to relieve the stress that we would have on our pastures the remaining part of the year. And some of the things that we can do to alleviate that stress, do early weaning. We could cull open cows early, do an early preg check and cull open cows early. Cull cows that are poor performers or that have poor body composition or some other factor that is not ideal or may limit their production. We may remove stalker animals if we have an operation where we have replacement animals or stalker animals that we could market more readily. We could remove those animals or a portion of them and reallocate those acres to our cows. Or we could even just remove all animals off of those pastures regardless and either take them to a dry lot, or perhaps if we're able to lease pasture somewhere in another region that isn't under drought, that has grass available, removing animals and transporting them to another location. Now, all those things are factors or options of what to do to try to reduce stocking rate further. But anyway, that's just the mindset of going through this flow chart. And you could go through and look at each of these boxes and assess what your current situation is and go through the different scenarios of some of the general original stocking rate adjustments to start the year and for spring turnout, and then adjustments that you can do later on in the season. Now, one way that you can also use weather data to help you with adjustments at the start of the year in stocking would be to look at the 30-year precipitation data for your region. And I have done that for a few locations here in Kansas, where I looked at the average or the precipitation over the last 30 years for each month within a year for these different locations and put them in a table, and then was able to look at the April plus May plus June precipitation all combined or added for a year, and also the May plus June precipitation added to each other for a year. And I put all these different precipitation amounts into a table, and I calculate the median of those 30 years. And the median is different than an average in that the median means that half of the years are above that number and half the years are below that number. So we basically have an equal chance, a 50% chance of having a number above that median value or below that median value. And we're able to use those numbers then to get a probability of what our expectation might be for precipitation for this particular site, and what our forage production might be for the end of the year based on this early season rainfall data. So looking at Scott City in particular, the median April plus May plus June precipitation, which I showed in my graph, was a very key component of being able to determine whether or not we're going to be close to our average average production for the year. The median April plus May plus June precipitation for Scott City for the last 30 years was 7.45 inches of precipitation. Hopefully y'all are able to see that in on your screen here with my pointer. So in looking at what happened last year, in 2022, we're going to go through the scenario of how we could use the rainfall data from 2022 compared to the median of April plus May plus June precipitation, and how we could use that then to possibly tell us whether or not we may need to do adjustments in our stocking by the end of the growing season. So anyway, the median for Scott City is 7.45 inches for April plus May plus June. And in 2022, they received 0.29 inches of rainfall. So that means after April, in order for us to reach that 7.45 inches, we would need 7.16 inches to fall in May and June. So in going through that spreadsheet from the prior screen, if we calculated up all the years in the May plus June precipitation column combined, if we looked at all the years where Scott City received at least 7.16 inches of rainfall, we would see that 8 out of those 30 years, Scott City got that much rain. So that's a 27% chance that in May and June to come, 27% chance that Scott City might receive that amount of rainfall. So that's telling us that we're starting off with a drier than average year, and our chances are pretty low. We still have some chance, but our chances are pretty low of getting the amount of rainfall we need to reach that 7.45 inch level. Now, when we look at adding the May precipitation into this, where we got 0.7 inches, if we subtract that then from this 7.16 inch deficit, we see that we are still 6.46 inches short. So we would have to get 6.46 inches in June to reach this 7.45 inch median level. And going back and looking at that prior spreadsheet and looking at just the June column, we would find that in June, only 4 out of the 30 years did Scott City receive that amount of rainfall in June. So that tells us that we had a 13% probability after last May, only a 13% probability of getting the amount of rainfall in June to reach our median level. So that pretty much tells me that we have a very, very high probability of not reaching our precipitation goal. And we are more than likely going to be short of rainfall for that April, May, June time period. And we have a high probability of being short of forage at the end of the season. So then we look and we see what did occur in June. And they had 1.29 inches of precipitation, which means they were just over 5 inches short for that early 3-month time period. That's a large deficit, and a very large deficit to try to make up. But some folks, may be optimistic and think, well, July, we still have a fair amount of the growing season left. If we receive precipitation in July, can we make up for some of that? So if we add the 5.17 inch deficit to the 3.03 inch median that's usually received in July, that means they would have to get 8.2 inches in July to make up for the rainfall needed by that time period. And in going through that spreadsheet and the prior 30 years, there were 0 years out of 30 where Scott City received 8.2 inches of precipitation. And that basically tells us that there's almost no chance for us to make up the amount of precip that we would need to get the forage production that we're looking for by the end of the year. So it's pretty much a sure thing that we are going to be short on forage by the end of the season. When we just look at that April, May, and June time period together. So by the end of June, we would already know that we're going to be really lacking for forage at the end of the year, and that stocking adjustments are probably going to have to be done. Otherwise, we're going to stress our pastures in that area. I did the same thing for Cocker City, up in the north central part of the state. Looking at the same months and doing the same totals for the 3 months put together and also for the 2 months put together. And the scenario for Cocker City was not as, I guess, dire as what it was for that Scott City area. Now, after April, Cocker City, they only had 0.3 of an inch of precip in that April time period. So that still left a large deficit to make up in May and June. And about 30% of the years in the last 30 years, Cocker City received that amount of precipitation needed to reach the median level, which was 9.26 inches. And looking at May, they received 5.5 inches of precip, which means that after April and May were added together, they were only going to be 3.44 inches short to reach that 9-inch median level. And 16 out of the 30 years from that prior spreadsheet, they were able to achieve that amount of precipitation just in May. So just over half the years, they were able to get that amount of precipitation. So that's a pretty good probability. What actually happened in June was they received 1.27 inches of precip, which means they were short by just over 2 inches of reaching their median for the year. And calculating that out, they are really close to that 75% of average for April plus May plus June combined for 2022, which puts them pretty much right on the borderline of whether or not they may need to do some stocking rate adjustments based on that April, May, and June time period. But according to these data, and they were in a much better situation than what the folks down around Scott City were. Now, some of the information I used to gather this data, I looked at the current and historic county precipitation data that's found on the website shown here. Also looking at soil moisture from the Kansas Maisonette in order to go through that flow chart earlier. There's also a couple other really good resources for predicting how much forage areas might receive by the end of a growing season. One of those is called GrassCast, and it's a website hosted by the University of Nebraska. But it is a website that you're able to look at a specific region on the Great Plains, and you're able to look at the expected production by the end of the year for a specific site based on 3 different scenarios of precipitation. below average precipitation, average precipitation, and above average precipitation, all three. And so it's a really good site to look at. And the data for it are based off of satellite imagery, ground truthing from historic data, and also on the current weather outlook. So it's a good source. And there's another source called the Rangeland Analysis Platform. And there's a page from that website that you're able to go in and highlight a specific pasture area, and you can get 16-day production estimates based on current satellite imagery for any particular pasture or region on the Great Plains that you want to look at. And so it's another great tool where you can get current year production as well as past production information on, and use that for doing any adjustments or looking at future production for your particular pasture in your particular region. So basically, in the end, the current growing season precipitation that we get this spring in April, May, and June is going to be the greatest factor in how much forage growth we get for the year. But prior year's energy level and status does have a factor. And also assess your pasture status before turnout. And again, at least one more time by the end of the growing season. And the most important time period to me, if you're going to only do one, would be by the end of June, and looking at that April, May, and June precipitation level and determining whether or not any further adjustments should be made. But current growing season precipitation is very important, but the prior year stress level on those pastures does have some importance, as well as what might be expected the following year. So I talked a lot of numbers here. And if you have any questions about anything that I just went over, there's my email address, so you can contact me through it, or you can also just give me a call. Our research center website has all of our contact information as far as phone numbers, etc. So feel free to also give me a call or send me a note through email, and I'd gladly go through any of this information with you.
Well, thanks, Keith. I have placed a lot of your links in the chat, as well as handouts that reflect your calculations. So I want to make sure people see those details in the chat. And one of the questions that came in related to, you referred to assessing that pasture, step one of your flow chart was assessing that current conditions. And the question was if you had any, how was it worded, an assessment protocol. Is that basically soil moisture and a little bit of cover? Can you expound on that?
Well, as assessing the prior year, I would say looking at knowing what your average production is for that pasture, and then assessing how much dry matter you have left in that pasture at the end of the season to see whether or not you reach that forage available to forage demand balance is probably the one main way to assess that, to see if the amount of residual you have at the end of the year is at a level that you expected to have, at least having that much residual based on your stocking rate and expected growth for the year. Also that Kansas Maisonette site, that has the soil moisture status for several different locations in the state. I realize that not everybody's able to go out and have some sort of soil moisture test on their own property, but that Maisonette tool is a great tool to go and look at and to see what the soil moisture status is for your region, because it's probably going to be highly applicable to any pasture sites that are going to be close to those. But anyway, I guess that's what I was looking at as far as assessing at the end of the year of how close you're able to meet that forage available to forage demand balance from the prior year.
Okay, another question that came in, Keith, was how far east do your precipitation relationships do you think hold true?
Well, I would say that they're very true for areas well, probably from Russell west. They're very applicable, and I would say they're going to be applicable for most of the midgrass region of the state, the Flint Hills region, and further east into the southeast. They have a longer growing season, more precipitation, and so you'll get precipitation that's going to be at different times of the year, earlier in the season and also at mid-season, that are probably going to translate into a little bit more forage growth than what we'd have out here in the western part of the state. But anyway, I would say from the basically the I-35 corridor west would be applicable and be highly correlated with parts of the state where we transitioned into the short grass and to the short grass prairie.
All right, as you have questions, if you want to type them into the Q&A box or the chat as well, but either of those work. Another question, Keith, when we think about, we had a certain level of stress, certainly last year from our further western Kansas perspective. How long does it take a pasture to recover and get back to normal biomass production? And maybe we take that if we just had last year and we were normal this year, and then the other option is that we're not, we got 2 abnormal years.
Well, that's a good question, and I guess the first thing I'll go to is some of our historical data at the research center here. In 1956, our Hayes Research Center had our driest year on record. We had just over 9 inches of precipitation that year, and our average is close to 23. And we had also our lowest forage production on record from any of our recorded experiments taking place. So we had our driest precipitation year on record and our lowest forage production year on record. Well, 1957 was a very good precipitation year. We had about 125% of our average precipitation, and our forage production rebounded as well. We had about 110% of our average forage production. So we were able to rebound in that one growing season back above average production because we had really good precipitation that year. Now, the forage production didn't reach a level where it matched the amount of precipitation we had, but it was able to rebound in that one growing season because the amount of precipitation we had. So the amount of precip we get is really the main driving factor. And that's also an interesting question in that I did look at those years where we are less than 75% of average for our April plus May plus June precipitation. I looked at those years where we were well below in our 3-month early growing season precipitation, and then looked at what took place the next growing season after those. And in analyzing those next growing seasons put together, the average forage production was about 15% lower than what our average precipitation level was. It was 12 to 15%. So anyway, if we achieved 120% of average precipitation that next growing season in April, May, and June, we achieved about 105 to 107% of our average forage production for the year. So it really depends on that next growing season, what the precipitation is. If we get 2 or more growing seasons put together where it's dry, that's when we start to think about plant density and plant survival, and we can have bigger impacts, similar to what we had in the 1930s droughts, where several years together ended up resulting in the loss of plant density and plant stand. And so, of course, forage production was much lower because of that.
Keith, am I correct in remembering the article you put together for November beef tips on learning from the drought in the 30s and the 50s? That kind of covers some of this same question in a written format.
Yes, it would. Yeah, it would be similar. Yep.
Yeah, so I posted that link in the chat as well. An article that Keith wrote. All right, Keith, we've got another question coming in about invader species, and what kind of invader species might we expect, and what should be the management steps to deal with those.
Well, as far as invader species, what I would expect could take place in some areas is we may have some annual species that would try to emerge or take advantage of lower perennial plant production, or maybe we have some a little bit loss of plant density in areas, and these annuals may be trying to take advantage of that. In many cases, if we have a dry growing season again, some of those annuals actually may be important forage for our animals out in pasture, and we could readily take advantage of those. Some species like kochia, some of the lamb's quarters, sunflowers, all those species are actually very palatable and can be very nutritious. And so in some cases we may not want to do anything with them, because they're going to be important for animal production, and they also could be important for just holding soil and occupying that area until the perennials are able to become vigorous and grow and become dominant and shade those out again or compete those out. In other cases where some of those annuals appear, it would be more of a case-by-case scenario of looking at those pastures and seeing what the species is. I can tell you that after the drought of 2011 through 2013, we had some pastures out here in western Kansas where we had some species that showed up in 2014 after we started receiving rainfall again that were really highly undesirable species, like Russian thistle and some others that showed up. Now, in many cases, just letting those plants or letting the pasture go through their recovery period was enough that over the course of a couple seasons, they were able to basically outcompete and not allow those invader species to even show up anymore. After 2015, even though we had Russian thistle in several pastures in 2014 and 2015 and 2016, they weren't even evident in pastures where there was no steps for any sort of control. So it's really, to me, it's more of a case-by-case scenario and seeing what some of those invaders might be, how they might be useful to the pasture, or if they pose any longer term threats to the pasture.
Kind of along that same line, Keith, what about ragweed, and when does ragweed become a concern? And
we have a few different studies that we've done on Western ragweed here at our research center, and one of the general conclusions that we've found is that it takes about 35% of the pasture population or dry matter in an area in order for that Western ragweed to inhibit grass growth. The grass that we have in our Western Kansas rangelands and the Western ragweed, they really complement each other very well in that they draw moisture from different parts of the soil profile. And so they actually are very compatible with each other. And it took 35% of the dry matter to be Western ragweed before it started reducing grass growth. But I think the reduction was more from shading rather than from a moisture status, because our native warm season grasses, they don't like being shaded. And so I think that's the area that Western ragweed started to inhibit, was doing some shading of that grass. But Western ragweed, the population of it really fluctuates according to weather patterns and precipitation. In tracking Western ragweed populations here at our research center, basically it holds steady or accumulates over time as precipitation holds steady or increases. But when we have dry periods, such as droughts of 2006, that dry year, the seasons of 2011 and 2012, and also this last year in 2022, our Western ragweed populations just naturally took a nosedive, and they're just going through their natural cycle based on weather pattern.
it's so, Keith, we really appreciate your detailed answers. If you have other questions, I do have our other beef specialist available online. Agronomist Jeannie Falk Jones is also available. Our focus certainly was range today, but while we're here, if you had any other questions that would fit those, we would welcome that. And again, I want to make sure you recognize the resources in the chat box. I did put the link to the website at Hayes with directly to Keith's page with his further contact information and more about his program there. We really feel like we're fortunate to have his skills there, and we certainly benefit from his expertise.
But I want to thank so many folks for hanging on after a whole hour. I'm glad to see that several folks stayed on and were able to join us for the whole hour. So that was great.
Yes, we appreciate you being here. For those of your friends that missed this, you can tell them that we will have this linked from ksubbeef.org as soon as we can get the logistics done after this. So ksubbeef.org will have it linked there, and you have our contact information also on that website. And if you have other questions that come about as you're trying to make management decisions given our current moisture situations, please don't hesitate to ask. We appreciate your time today. Not seeing any more questions. So I think we'll call it a wrap today. Thank you again, Keith, for sharing. Please get the things out of the chat that are important to you. And we will all be praying for some moisture in the coming days and weeks to come.